Okay, so we're looking today at the future of schools, and not from the point of view that everyone's talking about at the moment of technology and what role that's going to have post-lockdown in schools. We're thinking about an idea called powerful knowledge. That's become something of a buzzword in education circles, which you'll often hear on the lips of the schools minister or the head of Ofsted. Increasingly, you hear it from head teachers and their staff. Powerful knowledge is the big idea in schools at the moment. So we thought we'd look at the subject of powerful knowledge and whether it really does represent the future for schools. So it's a bit of a what Adam Buxton calls a ramble chat. I'm not quite sure where this is going to go, but if I just sort of introduce this idea of powerful knowledge for a couple of minutes, and then perhaps you can each talk about, where you've come across the idea and whether you find it useful or not. So powerful knowledge originates with a man called Michael Young, and he's long been an eminent sociologist at the Institute of Education, and he sort of worked in the tradition of sociologists like Durkheim and Bourdieu. And he started his career as a chemistry teacher, but his academic work, he was a research student of Basil Bernstein, who is another name in education. We might talk about him later. But Michael first came to prominence as the editor of a set of critiques of traditional education, and this is way back in 1971. It's called Knowledge and Control. And this is like a generation after the 1944 Education Act, where you've got these three types of schools: grammar schools, technical schools, and secondary moderns. And the failure of that kind of model, I think, convinced people like Michael Young that Bourdieu's argument was right. Schools just reproduce the inequalities that already exist in society. They don't change that, they just reproduce them. And so knowledge in schools is a tool for the powerful to preserve their power in society. So anyway, this was a highly influential book, and it can be seen as one of the early motors of the sort of social mobility argument in education, especially in sort of strands of progressive education. So anyway, it came as a big shock to the educational world in about 2008, I think, when Michael Young appeared to do a bit of a sort of turnaround, and produced a book called Bringing Knowledge Back In, which came out of his experience in South Africa, working with someone from the University of Cape Town called Johan Muller. And they became concerned not with the knowledge of the powerful, but with something that they call powerful knowledge. And this kind of takes Durkheim's idea of the sacred and the profane and applies it to education. And so powerful knowledge is the knowledge that frees pupils from their everyday profane knowledge, the knowledge from the everyday world and common experience. So it's a kind of abstract and systematized knowledge. So an example that Michael Young often cites is kind of London. There's the London that students might know as their home, their street, their part of town, where they go to enjoy themselves, where they go to buy chicken and chips. But then there's the London of history or geography or science and engineering, that kind of way of understanding London. And that's why it's powerful, because it liberates the learner from their own narrow view of the world, their kind of personal take on the world, to something that enables them to see it in a bigger landscape, or a wider picture, and so they can make more of themselves and more of the world with that knowledge. So I got to know Michael in about 2008 when that book was out, and we ended up sort of corresponding and becoming good friends, and we just disagree quite radically about a number of things, but I found Michael's work to be profoundly helpful in my thinking about education. So that's sort of my where I sort of interact with it. But what about yourself, Ruth? How did you come by powerful knowledge, and what does it mean to you?
Well, the first text I read was the, I think, 2014 Knowledge in the Future Schools that Michael Young wrote with David Lambert and Carolyn Roberts. Actually, I only came across it because it was displayed on a slide at a Research Ed conference with loads of other books that I knew to be wonderful. And I thought, oh, that's one I haven't read, so I must go and pick that up. And I did. And it has transformed, I think, my thinking and also the work that we're doing in the school I work in. And so I guess kind of my take on it is that, or something I think just to add to the analysis that you've given there is, so Michael Young talks about Future 3 as being, it talks about personal, powerful knowledge as being something that he conceives of that could be taught in a Future 3 schooling system. So he's got this sort of characterization of the school system of Future 1 and Future 2 and Future 3. So Future 1 is like the traditional sort of grammar school and private school curricula, where they've got the classical subjects, so Latin and the sciences and literature and mathematics. And that curriculum is seen as kind of like an interaction with the past, and the portrayal of knowledge is like as a fixed kind of item that students can kind of partake of. And that curriculum was only kind of historically available, wasn't it, to really very privileged students, like first of all, only to the boys of the very wealthy, and then just a kind of like some boys of or very kind of people who passed their 11 plus, or people who paid currently to go to private schools. And then the other kind of future, which you've alluded to there, was the sort of model of schools that developed into, I guess, progressive education as a reaction against that Future 1. And so the idea that actually, you know, rebelling against this idea of some kind of knowledge as an oppressive tool of power, and actually embracing the fact that knowledge is constructed, and, you know, this idea that students can be constructors of their own knowledge, and that there isn't really any privilege of one knowledge over another, because, you know, we seek equality and that should be reflected in our views of knowledge. And that's kind of like ideologically makes a lot of sense, as, you know, I certainly feel opposed to this idea of Future 1 in ideological terms. So I can see where, you know, where that came from in terms of sort of people's hearts, really. But the reason why powerful knowledge is such an amazing concept for me is that there's actually, you know, there are ethical and epistemological objections to both Future 1 and Future 2. So, like in Future 1, as I've just said, this idea that knowledge is a fixed item is wrong. You know, knowledge is constructed, and it's an ongoing thing. It's a discourse, and it's being created kind of, you know, as we speak, by people at the frontiers of their disciplines. And also just the idea that you can just categorically make truth claims without any kind of doubt in your mind. Well, that's been, you know, debunked by philosophers generation after generation. So those are the kind of epistemological objections to Future 1, and of course the ethical objection that, like, it was locking children out and it was only available to the elite. But then in Future 2, like, I think there's a significant epistemological objection, because, you know, although it answers this idea that you know, how it answers the idea that truth is a tricky idea, but then you just end up with this conclusion that all knowledge is of equal value, and that students can be, you know, that studying, you know, it doesn't really matter what knowledge you put in the curriculum. What matters is how the students feel about it, or the activities that they do when they feel about it, or this kind of nebulous idea of skills or transferable sort of abilities that they absorb osmotically through that experience. And that's epistemologically wrong as well. And I think it's more difficult to explain why that's wrong. But, you know, we all know in our heart of hearts that you know, there's something better about Shakespeare compared to, and I really like these books, but Horrid Henry, like they're just not the same thing, are they? And we have to acknowledge that. So Future 3 deals with that in this very clever kind of philosophical approach, which is social realism, and kind of locating the source of not objectivity, but of value placement on knowledge in the subject community, which perhaps we'll come on to later on. And I just want to point out as well the moral objection to Future 2, which is that the outcomes for Future 2 were just as elitist and just as exclusionary and just as damaging to children from not just disadvantaged backgrounds actually, but any background that wasn't highly privileged, in that students just ended up not leaving school with really very much knowledge at all. They weren't able to, in terms of qualifications, they weren't able to go and access further study and degrees, and just in terms of their own entitlement to knowing wonderful things about the world and the different kinds of meanings that our discipline makes, they were excluded from all of that wonderful discourse. And I think that is appalling, and for those reasons I welcome the concept of powerful knowledge from the bottom of my heart, because it allows us to square all of these circles and provide a meaningful alternative that answers, I think, all of those objections.
Wow, you see, I told you, Martin, Ruth knows far more about all of this than we do, or at least I do.
We've discussed a lot in my school, and the context of my school is one that was profoundly affected by some of the unintended consequences, I think, of Future 2, and so we feel it very much in our community.
Well, that's really important, that because this is getting traction in schools, and that's one of the things that'd be good to look at. But Martin, people often, I think, assume that you uncritically sign up with all of these ideas, and when actually one talks to you about it, you're not necessarily. There's a bit of a critique there. How did you come across all this stuff, and what does it mean to you?
Well, I first came across Michael when he rang me up, and I think it was, or sent me an email, I think it was on your behest, and went out for a beer with him. This was 2014, 2013, something like that, after Trivium came out, and he'd read Trivium and was very interested in it, and we had a great time. And he was a most lucid and jovial companion, I must say, and I've met him a couple of times since then, and talked to him at length about these things, and I am in the main someone who's a great supporter of bringing the knowledge back in, and very much in that vein. Where I find my differences with him, I think, can be summed up. I don't know if you know the piece he did, a talk on let's see, 25th of March, there you go, 2014, at Magdalen College, Cambridge. You see, that's Magdalen in Cambridge and Magdalen in Oxford. That's powerful knowledge, but there you go.
That's what anyway,
all this sort of stuff. But he did this, so I've got it here, and I think what's useful about this, number one, it's available on the internet so people can get it. And number two, because it also talks about how it would be seen in schools as well. But I'm interested in the jump between the sacred and the profane that you talked about in the example with London, because I've got a problem with this sort of putting down a line there between the two, between school knowledge and personal knowledge, if you like. And I think part of it is a reaction to a quote he's putting here about his own discipline, the sociology of education. And he quotes Kathleen Lennon: "All knowledge is situated knowledge, reflecting the position of the producer or knower at a certain historical moment in a given cultural context." And he's doing that. And then he says, if all knowledge is situated, this leads to relativism, which rejects the assumption of there being better knowledge. And this is where I do disagree with him. I think situated, we do come to knowledge personally. We do have a personal bent to it. If I see something or taste I don't know, taste some tea. I like the taste of tea with sugar or without sugar. You know, we have our personal tastes that come to it. And therefore, the subjective to me is a vital part, particularly in the arts, where we have our own personal tastes and our personal desires, our personal needs, you know, emotional fulfillment, our values, our politics, all these things. The cultural world, if you like, is something where we come to it personally, but also has our personal views together of it, you know. So there is, you know, structures around us that sort of make these, whether it be institutional or whatever, we look at these things together and also separately. And this is the cultural world. It's a subjective viewpoint, but we have lots of different subjective viewpoints that also come together and come out with another subjective. Well, this is better than this. So his rejection of there being things better than other things because it's subjective is wrong, I think. We don't come to art and say, well, this is a better picture than that one, and then you get told it. We have to have our viewpoints there because we do love something or hate something and all the degrees in between because of our own views of it. The second problem I've got, so I would agree with you, Shakespeare and Horrid Henry, I think, you know, but they're in different worlds, you know. But if I was 3-4 years old, perhaps I'd have a different view, perhaps, and perhaps that might be good or bad, I don't know. There's also the thing about subject communities, and I think subject communities are a great thing if you agree with the subject community you're talking about. And he himself talks about how he was rejected from the sociology of education. His own subject community was pushing him away and calling him a Govite. And as he says, I have almost lost good friends and colleagues of many years standing, feeling it very personally. You know, the subject community is a great thing if you agree with it. And I think this has come strongly from the history communities on Twitter, for example, who seem to have the history association seems to be a strong community and they seem to work together very well. Well, I come from a different view, the arts world, where the drama community, if you like, has very different viewpoints from me, perhaps. And my viewpoint is mainly about theatre and everything, you know, the importance of teaching theatre and something like that. Whereas the drama community is very much about drama as pedagogy, as drama for learning, and comes from that sort of example. So my subject associations, if you like, are not somewhere that I find a home with the ideas I come up with. And finally, so I've only done 3 of these points, but I can go on and on and on, is when we get to 10 things to remember. So Carolyn Roberts, who I've also met and is head teacher of school.
Carolyn Roberts was one of the co-authors of Knowledge and the Future School, yeah, which is the book that we're discussing. Yeah.
So she comes up with 10 things to remember, which she gives to her staff. And I like the first one, number 1. Knowledge is worthwhile in itself. Absolutely, this is where I agree. When she says schools transmit shared and powerful knowledge on behalf of society, I start to wobble a bit. We teach what they need to make sense of. And again, I wobble there because who's saying what you need and where does this come from? And improve the world. And I worry about that as well, because I think we can quite happily not improve the world and still be part of it. Shared and powerful, schools transmit, I've just said that. Shared and powerful knowledge is verified through learned communities. Well, that's what I've just talked about. Children need powerful knowledge to understand and interpret the world. Without it, they remain dependent on those who have it. Now, this comes back to the split between London that you know and London that you're taught. I think you need the London you know and the London you're taught, and where that line is drawn is not clear, and not necessarily true line either. You know, that this is the abstract, important, powerful, knowledge, and this is the powerless knowledge. Without us having a way into it, it's powerless. There's no such thing as powerful knowledge. So I gave the example in my book about Athena versus the machine, about B.B. King. That which is more powerful, being B.B. King playing Lucille, or doing a PhD on B.B. King? Now, to me, it makes a nonsense of that line, because you can't do your dissertation on B.B. King without him having been B.B. King doing his stuff. So I think that the sacred and profane are, you know, we draw on those things. We have a vertical thing from the shit on the bottom of our shoe to God up there. You know, there is this sort of relationship between the two. And without them, how can you know which is better than what? How can you know which is more truthful than without getting into that discussion about things? And the final thing here
is this is the fourth of your 3 points, is it?
No, my 3 points include her 10 points. So this is in the school. So shared knowledge, a foundation for just and sustainable democracy, citizens educated together, share an understanding of the common good. And that idea of the common good, again, where is the ability to be outside and the critique of the common good? How do I say that's a common good if I don't share in that common good? Where is this ability to discuss, to disagree, to say that is not powerful, that is not the knowledge, that is not the right way of seeing things? And so to bring that in more. So for me, it's conversation rather than powerful knowledge. It is getting involved in that conversation, which is in itself powerful, but it has to have the subjective in there. And if you throw away the subjective, the pupil, the human being, if you like, then we don't get into that discussion and we don't educate properly, because we're just saying, this is powerful knowledge, nothing to do with your life. It's over here. We're going to release you from your life and bring you out over here and free you, you know, through this. And I don't buy that. And I don't think it's good for us, if you like, because it is saying also, if we are brought up by parents who happen to already believe in that sort of and surround us with the abstract world, are we already liberated before we get to school, which then kind of undermines the whole thing on that side.
Okay, well, I mean, there's loads to talk about, isn't there? And I'm sure Ruth is itching to come back at you a few things there. But I just want to be clear, because I mean, I've got a lot of sympathy with the critique you're giving, and that's something we do need to discuss. But isn't it the case that without someone drawing a line somewhere, and without someone saying this is what we consider sacred and this is the rest of it, which is profane, without that you just can't get off the ground? And so whilst we might be looking for some nuance in this, essentially that first division between what is worth teaching and what is less worth teaching, isn't that essential?
No, you must do that. You've got to choose not to teach most of the things in the world. Even in your subject area, you've got to choose to get rid of most of it and to allow pupils into the world of it somehow, and choose what you think might be best to communicate that world to them. Doesn't necessarily mean you're teaching the best of that subject, by the way. It's the best as a way into that subject. Absolutely. And you have to choose what to put in, and what you choose is supremely important. What you choose to teach but it's whether it's sacred or profane is a different matter altogether.
If I've got you right, are you not therefore saying, because to be fairly brutally honest about it, I mean, you're someone who's developed this part of their career out of discussing curriculum, and it's really the turn towards powerful knowledge that has reinvigorated talk about curriculum. So do you see yourself as continuing the kind of project that Michael Young has been partly responsible for setting up? Or do you see yourself now in contention with people who stand up and say, this is a school that teaches powerful knowledge? Try and be brief on that, because I want to come back and hear what Ruth has to say about what he said. But
the answer is yes to both of them, probably. So yes, I think Michael's opened up a huge ground for us, which is exactly right, and I agree with him on so much. I'm only looking at the stuff I disagree with him for the sake of the discussion. Or else, why have me here when Ruth can so ably do the whole thing otherwise? So I'm looking at some of the areas where I would disagree, and I still haven't heard what the difference would be necessarily between my view and what the powerful knowledge view would be of content. And if we get down to content, then it's perhaps a discussion where you can say, well, that's why I put that there, and that's why I wouldn't put that there. That might be to be had within the departments. I put it down to departments rather than the subject associations, by the way, what should be in and what shouldn't. But anyway.
So Ruth, you're a science teacher, aren't you?
Yeah. Yes, I am. Yes, a physics teacher.
Okay. So I mentioned that because one of the criticisms of the powerful knowledge idea is it doesn't really talk about the arts at all. So Martin's been getting into that. You know, okay, in the sciences maybe it works to a greater extent, more viable than it does in the arts. I mean, how do you see that from being a science teacher, being physics in particular, you know, which is a really kind of structured kind of subject where if you're in disagreement with the subject communities, and by that, you know, basically we're meaning universities and university research departments, if your physics disagrees with that, it's not really physics in a way that it doesn't apply to the arts. So how do you see that distinction?
Yeah, definitely. Gosh, there's so many things to talk about there. I think one thing is actually I would question slightly that definition of the subject community. I think that it can be defined much more broadly and context specifically. So I think that you know, I think it's okay, like in your case, Martin, to say I'm going to define the subject community as all the teachers of drama on Twitter who agree with me, or who have, you know, or who are in a place to have a debate with me on the same kind of conceptual framework. And that's obviously, you know, limiting and you know, can be subject to criticism, and it doesn't perhaps fulfill all of the social realist requirements. But I think that can be really, really powerful. And so you're not confined by, you know, if your subject association isn't really that good, you're not constrained by that. You know, there are lots of other people, you know, some more in some subjects than others, who are out blogging, writing books, active on Twitter. So I would want to extend that category to them. But in terms of like what you've asked about, the sort of the specialist knowledge and versus the arts, you know, sciences versus the arts, I think what you said there, Martin, about the fried chicken and then the BB King, like they're quite different, aren't they? Like the fried chicken, that doesn't need teaching. The children will absorb that naturally from how they go about their daily lives. But playing a musical instrument needs explicit teaching, and so I think that that's an important distinction for us to make. And powerful knowledge does, you know, in some places make this point that powerful knowledge is knowledge that is kind of codified and rarefied and has specialist structures and vocabulary and things, and therefore needs a specialist teacher. So I think that's worth considering, and we can, and that allows us to you know, consider arts under that umbrella. There's other things that, you know, but then I always want to know about sort of engineering and technology, and I mentioned computer science in an earlier conversation. You know, do these things fit the code for powerful knowledge? I don't know, but I think that they're really important, and you know, and I you know, there is I think what you were kind of talking about a bit before, Martin, was like, is there a sort of snobbery about kind of you know, posh subjects and dirty subjects and things like that? And I'm really keen to avoid that. I think you know, it might be the case that things like engineering actually are more appropriate to learn later in a sequence because of like, it might be that physics is more of a like fundamental thing that's then more transferable. You know, like if there's a branch of kind of specializations, physics might be more in the trunk, and engineering and other things might be further up in branches. But like, that hasn't been like definitively shown as far as I'm aware. And I think there is a real danger, and we must guard against it, to kind of, you know, white collar subjects and blue collar subjects, when actually, you know, some of our most noble and human achievements have been through things like, you know, engineering technology, like tools and changing our environment are just absolutely incredible, aren't they? And so so that's something that I think like is important. But I guess like the main thing for me is that you know, if people could be having this conversation in schools across the country, then by God, like the curriculum that they came out with would be amazing. Like whether they decided to, you know, to be more on a kind of, you know, whether they included certain things as powerful knowledge or not, or whether they, you know, wherever they drew this line between the sacred and profane that we've been discussing, like that kind of intentional drawing of that line is always going to deliver something much more meaningful.
But will it? But will it? Because there's absolutely value, and I think, you know, we probably all agree on that. There's value in teachers talking amongst themselves and in their own department and between departments about curriculum and what's going into what they're going to teach. But does the idea of powerful knowledge confuse things somewhat? I mean, you know, we had to kind of have our little 10-minute introduction into what we mean when we say powerful knowledge, and the thing I often encounter when you talk to people about this concept is they often want a nice, clean, simple definition of what we're talking about, and we're struggling to really nail that down. I want to pick up this idea of the kind of knowledge communities, the subject associations and all that kind of thing. I think I'm right in saying that this is something that Michael Young took from Basil Bernstein, the idea of communities of inquiry. And I like what you're saying there, Ruth, that actually what is a community of inquiry? Okay, it might in large part represent university research departments, you know, people doing PhDs and generating new knowledge, but then, well, especially when it comes to teaching, your teacher in the classroom surely has something to contribute to that. But aren't they just, Martin, aren't communities of inquiry, if you're going to take part in that conversation in a significant level, sure, you can disagree with someone who's writing a PhD on the subject, but don't you just have to, isn't it just forcing you to make a strong argument and be absolutely sure of what you're saying about the subject? Nobody's saying you can't make an opinion, you can't express an opinion. Your opinion just has to be credible amongst people who really know their onions on this. Isn't that's not a problem, is it?
Yeah, well, I go back, I mean, the quote is from, again, the Carolyn Roberts bit here: we need to keep in touch with universities' research and subject associations. So keeping in touch with, but then shared and powerful knowledge is verified communities. So those are the learning community. They and shout resistance too. And I think that's a perfectly viable thing to do, by the way. I don't see that's a problem. But I think you have to have an opinion of that argument. And certainly you need to be able to put yourself up, but you don't necessarily need their approval.
Isn't it asking a lot then, Ruth, if Martin's right, isn't it asking a lot of teachers, busy teachers, probably at the end of a Monday when that's the time the meeting's going to happen where people are going to talk about this stuff? Isn't it asking a lot for them to be able to be thinking about their subject in those terms and maybe thinking, am I an outsider on this issue? You know, I need to have read lots of books and sort of have an opinion. Doesn't all of that, doesn't the kind of disciplinary aspect of the subject just become too much for your average working teacher to take account of in their practice?
Well, no, Gareth, I would say that it's the job of senior leadership teams to free up their teachers' time and to ensure that behaviour is impeccable, that all centralised systems that can be in place are in place. There's no, crazy performative practices, and, deep marking and infinity data drops and all those other kind of, hideous things that we've seen in schools up and down the country for many years now. If you can remove all of that, then actually your teachers have got the energy and the time to engage in that discourse. But, and it can be something that can be curated and led and managed. I think that there's certainly a role for SLT in or other curriculum leaders in seeking out, particular articles that or links with specialists, you know, in other parts of the country or whatever, to kind of direct and streamline that that discourse. You know, people haven't got kind of hours and hours to just kind of laze around on Twitter and wait until they come across something good, but certainly like a directed and a planned and intentional engagement absolutely must be the priority of any school, I think.
No, that's really interesting. I often find that when I talk to teachers in those terms, in the kind of terms you've just set out, suddenly they're far more excited about the job than you know, than they were when they were staring at a pile of books to mark. But of course, it's not to say that those things aren't important. The marking and the results and everything else aren't important. But yeah, it's the sort of spirit, isn't it, of what you do. But this leads me on to a really important aspect in Knowledge and the Future School. Michael Young makes the point that a school's first priority in this third future 3, the one in which we realise that knowledge is not just about what the elite think and then transmitting that, but neither is it a kind of mishmash of relativist, well, whatever you think the truth is, that's it. This third future, he says in the book, a school's first priority is that students are excited about what they learn. Now, this immediately takes us into Martin's area of their subjective engagement with the subject. And I've sort of noticed that a lot of the discourse around powerful knowledge seems a lot of the time to be aimed against what used to be called engagement or having fun. You know, in the kind of Future 2 model, it's all about how much the student is enjoying the subject and not so much about some sort of disciplinary structure to the whole basis of what they're learning. So how do you feel about engagement, Ruth? Is that a dirty word? Is that a profanity to you? And yeah, and I was just going to say after that, Martin, I'd be interested in whether you think this does hinge a bit on engagement, on whether doing stuff because the student is getting an enjoyment out of it is more important than perhaps the powerful knowledge debate has so far discussed. But anyway, Ruth, what was your thought first of all?
Well, I think if we pursue engagement as the objective, then we will fall into terrible holes, and you just get the Matthew effect, don't you? Because children from privileged backgrounds, blah blah blah, are more engaged in like dragons, whatever, or and children from other less privileged backgrounds are more engaged in like playing on the tablet or to kind of to caricature the situation a bit, but you bring to you're engaged in things that you're already interested in, aren't you, which is a marker of privilege, and like it is the job of adults to bring children into habits which they don't necessarily feel inclined to in the first place. Like my children aren't really engaged in like cleaning up their toys and things, but like I make them do it because it's good for them to learn these habits, and that's my job. And I think that the same can be said for education. However, there's lots of kind of habits and routines that you can do in the classroom to build engagement, and just to make sure that the more attention children pay, the more engaged that they can't help being engaged. Or sorry, the opposite is true. If you're not paying attention, you can't be engaged, can you? So you can enforce attention, and that makes it easier to get engagement. And so all of those things, I don't think that we should kind of pursue engagement for its own sake. However, when they are engaged, it's just wonderful, isn't it? When you're teaching a class of children who just want to find out more, and their expressions, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful thing. So I think that it's not like it's a bad thing if it's a byproduct of what we are teaching, and the quality of the planning that's gone into that teaching, and the quality of the explanations and the sequencing and how it builds, and the practice that we give the students, and how we enable them to make progress and do hard things that they weren't able to do before. That is an incredibly rewarding experience, isn't it? You know,
I'm going to push on this first because yes, being able to do things that they couldn't do before seems, I think, the point of the exercise from what you're saying. Then engagement becomes the byproduct. But in my reading of Future P, engagement is schools' first priority. So it's almost the other way around, that you have to get their involvement at a kind of psychological level almost before you can begin to construct disciplinary structures for them.
Yeah, I think it's probably like a bit of a chicken and egg type thing, isn't it? And you can just build on successes in each sort of strand cumulatively to an extent. But like, I'd still rather, you know, I mean, I wasn't really engaged in learning any maths for the whole time I was at school, but like, I'm really glad that I was forced to do it now. And I'm glad that that happened, although it wasn't really, you know, a very ambitious kind of curriculum or anything like that, or teaching. I'm glad it was that way around than like, oh, I was engaged the whole time and didn't really learn anything.
Well, that takes us to Martin. Martin, in your first book, Trivium, you said, you know, one important part of the trivium is the grammar, and in the traditional understanding, the grammarians, you know, had a stick or a whip or whatever it was and beat the discipline into the learner. You know, you can't just start with, hey, this is really interesting. But so where do you come at what Ruth just said? Do you think engagement is the most important thing a school is doing, or not?
You're strangely trying to put me on the line of caning children is a good thing.
Well, you came up with the image when you told me about Trivium, so it's all down on you.
I think it's a point of view, but no, I think thinking itself is fun. So if you start out with the idea that thought is fun and being engaged in thought is fun, you become unapologetic about teaching things that are difficult, that things that are of interest, that perhaps, and I don't want to use this line about the sacred and the profane though, because if you just say, well, this is sacred and it's difficult to get into, you know, then it becomes something we've got to really work hard at here, and enjoyment will come later when you understand it, but the moment you don't understand it. I think the line between the two, by blurring it more, the thinking can become more interesting and engaging, if you want that word, earlier than perhaps if you say, you know, it's all marshmallows, you can have them in 5 weeks' time rather than now, or something like that, you know. But if you go out just to entertain, then what's the point, you know? And I'm speaking as a drama teacher whose job is to, at some point, entertain someone. You would hope at some point, you know, there's the hard graft that goes with it as well. But like learning to take part in a marathon, you know, the first steps might be done with a certain enthusiasm, I'm going to do it, but then there's the lull, you know, and how to build up through and go through all that to build up an enjoyment at a level which you've never experienced before until you've actually done that marathon, you know. So you've got to balance these things, and as a teacher you've got to work with time scales, that certain things are going to be enjoyable earlier, certain things a bit later. And we play around with this, and certain things are a bit boring, but we don't need to advertise that fact and just say, come on, resilience, you'll get through, you know, you'll get an A or something like that at the end of it if you do. I don't think that's necessarily part of it. So if you believe what I'm teaching you is interesting, my God, it's interesting, it's stimulating, it's got something for it, then I think you're fine. I think you're fine, you know. But that's perhaps difficult in different subjects, you know, and some subjects will, perhaps your math subject more difficult than a drama, you know. I don't know, perhaps.
I think there's definitely a tension in the argument for the value of your subject is in its abstraction and it's in its system, and how it's divorced, if you like, from your ordinary experience. I think Martin's got a point there, that's a problem. But it seems to me, and I don't really know whether that's necessarily what Michael Young would mean anyway. You know, in the classroom, I'd be interested to see Michael Young sort of teach a lesson, wouldn't it, and how he would go about the task. But it seems to me that there's both sides of the debate sort of miss a crucial movement, which is that it's a dynamic thing that goes from the ordinary knowledge, the profane knowledge that the student comes with, moves out to the abstract, but then crucially comes back again. And I don't know if that's exactly what you were saying before, Martin, but Ruth, don't you think that's a necessary part, that you can't just have the abstraction and the systematizing, but at the same time, if you don't have that, you're losing a vital part. So you have to go to it, but then crucially come back. Is that not a fairer way of viewing the situation?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that sounds a lot like the stuff from legitimation code theory and the work of Carl Mayton in terms of semantic waving, and the idea that you know, starting with something concrete and familiar, or concrete or familiar, and then developing an understanding of something abstract, and then being able to bring it back down, especially like into a new context, is you know, very empowering to students. And I think that that's a really useful model. Is that the kind of thing you're asking?
I think so. Is that what you meant, Martin? Is it this movement from the everyday to the abstract, but back to the everyday?
It can be. I think it's the thing about taking the subjective out, which worries me, is losing things around taste, developing a palate, developing opinions, thinking from unusual angles about things, perspectives, the importance of perspectives, not just that this is the one thing that's over there and now you understand that one thing, but you can actually have a range of views on that thing. But what
does that mean in maths? I can get that in drama, your subject.
Yeah, you tell me. I don't know. Perhaps, I mean, but this is part of the problem with which I get a lot. I talked to Robert Bjork about this, and he said the trouble with a lot of education research is that the students we tend to use are those who are near us. In other words, for a start, they're graduates, undergraduates generally, and they're either in the science or maths faculties.
Right.
and he says all this stuff, you know, we're measuring, because that helps to measure things that we teach, something that we can measure whether it's successful, been remembered, and all this sort of stuff. And of course, in certain subjects, that sort of way of approaching it works a bit better than it perhaps does in other subjects, where we are not developing this is the one thing to know and this is the way to know it. There are a wider range of things to know and ways of knowing it and ways of coming to it that are slightly more nuanced, subjective, subtle, difficult to measure things as well, you know. And that's where the breadth, and this is where the whole SLT sort of developing one way of marking things, doing things, and this is it, can ride roughshod of certain subjects, you know. Anyway, that's my thing. Yeah,
I mean, you could read that then from what you've said as an argument that, yeah, actually powerful knowledge as a concept relates more to sciences and kind of.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What's in content terms, what's the difference between Future 1 and Future 3 in content terms?
I think I've got a view on that, but Ruth, I'm going to allow you to step into the lion's mouth.
One of the things that we haven't mentioned yet, and I think this speaks a lot to your point about Martin, what you've described as like the subjective and the kind of the whole schema and personal approach, the personal knowledge that is brought to all knowledge, but that seems to kind of manifest itself and be much more significant in the arts, but not only the arts, is that in Young's conception of powerful knowledge, the nature of the production of the knowledge and what we might call the disciplinary strand is really key. And he talks about, you know, it being really important to teach children about how the knowledge is produced, and that being kind of you know, beneficial One, because it kind of it mitigates against a lot of the kind of knowledge as power sort of stuff that he warned about in Knowledge and Control, about, you know, the idea that, you know, fascist governments or whatever can say that, can make facts, can state, you know, make statements, and people just have to kind of go along with them without having any kind of awareness that knowledge is something that's produced and can be challenged and can be developed. But also this idea that students can then see knowledge as like a discourse that they are being brought into and can join and can be producers of at the edge of the, you know, not just at the edge, because not all disciplines kind of have edges in the same way, but, you know, in the field of production. So that for me is the difference between Future 1 and Future 3, or certainly, you know, one of the significant differences is that there's an explicit element of how knowledge is produced and approved within the discipline, and obviously that looks very different for subjects like maths, the arts and history, for example.
So I'm going to lay my cards on the table and say that I think my own view on powerful knowledge is exactly that. You've captured it well in that question. There is something missing in the knowledge, and I think in those structured subjects, like, you know, I'm a science teacher too, is aesthetic. What you were talking about, Martin, in terms of taste and appreciation of things from a subjective point of view, science, which has been completely overlooked, I think, including by the powerful knowledge approach. That, one specific sort of example, I think the ability to make metaphor is crucial to both develop science and understand how science works. And I'd cite the example of Newton, you know, the story of the apple falling on his head and he goes, hey, gravity, that's apocryphal. But what Newton definitely did was look at the way the apple falls to earth and say, that's the same as the earth falling towards the sun. And that's metaphor making. That's a metaphorical thing that's gone on there. And when you really get stuck into metaphor, it's a highly subjective process, which you then have to make abstract in the sciences in a way that in the arts you can stay on the subjectivity. But every single part, every single development in mathematics has come through this subjective commitment to something, which has then been worked out in a formalism. And I just don't hear any kind of discussion of the place of aesthetics within science, apart from let's make a poster, or, you know, you've drawn a lovely picture, which is a kind of bastardization of the whole process of the arts. So I think the way that powerful knowledge almost mitigates against talking about the arts and including an idea of subjectivity is actually a problem for the very subjects it intends to support. But I have to say, I don't get much, you know, as soon as I say, let's talk about the aesthetics of physics, people just look really blankly. What do you think about the aesthetics of physics, Ruth? Sorry, Martin, I'll bring you in a second, but Ruth, what do you think about aesthetics and physics, you know, discuss?
We've got it in our curriculum, actually, Gareth.
Just showing off now.
Only a small bit, and it would be wonderful to have more, but just the just about Copernicus's you know, Neoplatonist interpretation of the data that was pre-existing, and just his idea that it was just aesthetically more pleasing to have a heliocentric model of the universe. So so that's in there, and I absolutely think it's important, and I think that, you know, it might end up that following a discussion, you know, people decide that in terms of recontextualization, is it, you know, is how much of a victim do we want to go to that? And that's you know, that's something that needs to be discussed, and if the decision is that that's something that we'd rather have just as a few kind of anecdotes dotted throughout, then I feel much more comfortable with that than what seems to be the case in most places, which is that it's just overlooked. And I think that, you know, it's important to we haven't mentioned history and geography actually, and literature studies, because they're not like creative in the same sense as the arts, but they are what you might call interpretivist, and the role of the knower and everything that they bring that knowing, I think, is really key. And I think that actually those discussion of lenses and interpretation is certainly a key thing in history curriculum. It's not so much really at geography, certainly at GCSE, and that might be something you know, for us to think about as a curriculum community going forward.
That's fascinating. But Martin, you were keen to.
No, I was going to just talk about Carlo Rovelli and his stuff. I mean, he writes in a way that I think is beautiful, even through translation. It works as a beautiful way of looking at physics. But also, physics itself touches on so many things that are fundamental to us, whether it be through consciousness or whatever you want to talk about. It has its abstractions, which are actually very deep to our understanding of ourselves. So to me, it's a deeply philosophical subject, probably because I come to it through knowing very little about it. But Rovelli talks about how science too often ignores the subjective view, the view of the knower that Ruth just talked about there. And he sees that as a problem, and I would agree with that. Kevin Mitchell, in his book Innate, talks about learning and just says there is no learning without the subjective. There is no learning that goes on without the subjective. So to pass it by as just profane or whatever is a danger, I think. And but how to bring it in is the danger as well. I'm not saying, you know, I'm not saying, hey, just throw in the object. Yeah, and we've got to avoid, and this is the difference I make to it, if you like, we've got to avoid the idea of relativism. That we have to get into discussion that some things are better than other things, but how we know those things aren't necessarily obvious. And the science community over the whole COVID-19 thing, you know, how does science know when it's grappling in the dark? How does it know? You know, and it as a community is disagreeing. It's having these arguments. It's having that. And in order for us to understand how the science isn't one thing, that it has many tentacles, you know, and disagreements and arguments, I think is such an empowering thing for people to get involved in. That there's too many armchair scientists out there just getting, you know, epidemiologists getting involved there like they know because they come from their value system says this is true. That actually we need to get involved, that science isn't just one objective thing, but it deals in objectivity, and it deals in a certain amount of data that it has to use. And we need, you know, so science education itself has to be, I don't know, relatable, for want of a better word.
Oh, I was all for everything until you said it out. Science just has to be relatable, but I do know what
but relate to the people who are being fed the science, you know, and getting involved in the conversation. It was the wrong word.
No. You're really right to say, you know, to identify this idea of the science. You know, what is the science on this? I think as science teachers, we'd be the first to agree with you that the concept of the science, you know, even take Newton's law of gravity, you know, I mean, at whichever end you want to come at that, Newton's ideas in originally formulating it were not entirely scientific. He was looking for a spiritual principle. Einstein's revision of Newton's understanding of gravity is absolutely revolutionary, and even now trying to kind of nail down the mechanism by which gravity works is still a great big unknown. So even something as everyone's go-to metaphor for scientific theory, gravity, you know, even that has got all sorts of holes in it, and subjectivity is really important. So I think we are in a situation where we talk about certain types of knowledge as the knowledge. In other words, in a future one kind of way. This is just how it is, and you have to accept that. Otherwise, you can't make your way in the world. I think that even in future 3 is problematic, and the way to get at the problem is, I think Martin's right, is to try to identify where subjectivity plays a role, But the second thing you mentioned just there, and I think, you know, again, I think I've detected this in what Ruth's saying, is that subjectivity, where it has been discussed, has been done just really badly. It's on an absolute equivalence that objectivity actually, if you discuss subjectivity, you have to dispense with objectivity, and that's that sort of dialectical movement I've been talking about, of going to the abstract, to the objective, but coming back again and working out what that means. I think that's really important. We're going to have to finish soon, but I just wanted to tuck in another point, which is that we talked about the subject communities, or the communities of inquiry, the subject associations, what university departments think. I just wondered to what extent each of you worry about how well the academy now thinks about its own subjects, because we seem to see a lot of debate going on there, not the kind of debate that we've necessarily been talking about, but almost like a straining to disavow itself of what used to be the canon, if you want to, you know, not just in literature or arts, but also in the sciences. So when it comes to literature, often university departments will be the first to tell you that, you know, it needs to be decolonized and all of that. When it comes to the sciences, you see a lot of university departments now saying, well, there's Aboriginal mathematics. You know, I think New Zealand did a whole thing in its curriculum about this is the way Aboriginal cultures did maths, and therefore we need to include that. Do you think that is a big issue, or do you think that that's a minor issue, that actually the disciplines are fairly certain about what's in their discipline and what isn't anymore? Martin, you can go.
I'll read. Right. Okay. I wonder who's getting that first. I think it's a crucial question, and a very salient at the moment as well. What's included in the curriculum and why has got to be at the forefront. The thing I don't consider a curriculum is just a list of things taught one damn thing after another. But here's something, right? Oh dear, we've got 3 men, right? We need 3 women right now. They're all white, so we need, and it becomes one thing after another. What I do think is that grand narratives matter. And to give an example of a grand narrative, let's talk about the British Empire, which is something that some schools say they teach and some schools perhaps don't teach. I mean, if you're teaching the British Empire, you've got to teach colonialism, you've got to teach the whole picture, you've got to teach within that all the forgotten voices that have perhaps been taken over by future one curriculum, you know, over the years, and all narrative parts out there, a lot of things that have been swept away for various reasons to tell certain stories in certain ways. And a lot of that is included in some of the great works, you know, the great works, whether it be Taming of the Shrew, for example. You know, we have straight away something which opens itself up for, well, we've got to look at this in lots of different ways. You know, we can't just sort of say, well, this is great. Is it great? You know, so I think we've got to include voices, perspective. I keep actually, because I think this perspectives is the word I keep coming back to. Perspectivism is different than relativism. It's not saying that everyone is the same, everyone has the same, but there are the importance of perspectives that we bring to the truth. And we have the perspectives here, and perhaps the more perspectives we have, the more towards a truth we can get. So see, in a slightly strange sentence, but I don't know that schools look at things in that way. And I think if we just add lots and lots of stuff done by different people, it doesn't bring perspectives. It's just sort of ticking boxes, and that's a different thing. So a constructed narrative that has dialectic, that has argument there, that has different ways of seeing certain things, is different than just having tick boxing lots of things because they happen to be made by certain people. And even then, you know, you can have people of color, people, white people, whatever, who have the same perspective on things, you know. So it's important to get balance and all those different ideas coming through. So it's the overall narrative construction. How is the stories we are telling, how are these told? How do they have a dialogue with each other, rather than just, this is just because it needs to be. Whereas maths, you talk about, a lot of maths, for goodness sake, if you just sort of open it up, how much of that comes from outside the Western white world? You know, a lot of it, a lot of maths, for example, it comes from Asia. I think the number zero, who discovered that? You know, I mean, and anyway. You know.
Well, that's a really good example. Ruth, what's your take on it? Do you think, for example, the Arabic contribution to physics, or do you think that's a kind of tokenism that is the wrong way around, that it's the subject that should,
well, you said
should
Newton,
lead?
you said Newton, didn't you? So anyway.
I think that,
Sorry, Martin, I don't understand what you mean. What?
No, you personify gravity with saying Newton or Einstein.
Okay.
So you personify it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Ruth, what do you think?
well, you know, I actually think that debate is a healthy one to have within the academy, and that the canon should be the subject of critical thinking and discussion, and that we should, you know, ask ourselves about where, you know, we might want to make developments in you know, what scares me a lot is that it doesn't really feel like a debate a lot of the time. You know, a trend that I see reported is, you know, things like people being shut down for expressing, for wanting to debate the canon or other kind of related areas, certainly within universities, and kind of trends of no platforming and things like that. And that terrifies me because, you know, I've got, you know, the countries where people aren't allowed to have discussions and to question things and to, you know, to participate in debates, those are the countries that have gone quite bad politically, and become quite scary places to live. So I'm sorry to kind of finish on a really kind of doom prophesizing note, but yeah, I think that, you know, debate is very healthy and we should encourage it, and we must guard against, you know, where debate is shut down. It worries me.
But do you think that is part of Future 3? In other words, do you think that's an issue for the academy, and by the time you're recontextualizing in a school, that you're not in really a position to bring that in? Or do you think part of Future 3 is to say that, you know, that this is a perspective that grew out of a bunch of white guys many centuries ago, you know?
I think it depends on the subject, but certainly, you know, I've seen very successful history curricula that, you know, explicitly teach the contested nature of interpretations, and I think that can be done really well, and that's entirely appropriate for students. Obviously, everything is an opportunity cost, and you know, it's debate. You know, I don't know how much you'd want to spend in maths, but, you know, sometimes it doesn't take very long to kind of, you know, just give a bit of hinterland or whatever, a bit of context to where maths has come to demonstrate the diversity and to challenge a lot of kind of assumptions that everything kind of just like got sorted out in England or whatever. So yeah, I think that absolutely it can form a part of the recontextualized curriculum.
Fantastic. I'm just gonna end on the thought that latterly, in the conversations I've had with Michael about powerful knowledge, he has begun to take a much more critical stance on his own work, which for me is the sign of a really good thinker who can set up this thing, but then when you're all going, oh yeah, you might be onto something, but no, I'm leaving that behind. I wouldn't necessarily say he's leaving it behind, but you know, he said to me on a few occasions that in some respects he thinks Knowledge and the Future School wasn't exactly a failure, but didn't quite work in the way he hoped, because he and the others wrote that book for heads, to really try to get them to think about how they might be shaping the future of education. And it's a debate that didn't really get taken up. However, the term powerful knowledge, as we started with, has become a bit of a buzzword. And in fact, you know, many schools that want to be seen as innovative and thrusting forward drop the term powerful knowledge, but it's scratched beneath the surface and they don't really have an articulated understanding of what they mean. So it's become a bit of a buzzword. But perhaps even more than that, the school minister in various speeches.
Yeah,
can you
come
hear
closer.
me, Martin? Yeah, sorry. Schools minister in various speeches has sort of dropped the words powerful knowledge into speeches and so on, and inevitably it's therefore become associated with a right-wing view of education because he's a conservative minister, you know. And I think Michael, like you alluded to, I think Martin has picked up a bit of flack from people he's worked with in the past who thought that he was really acting as some sort of mouthpiece for Gove's philosophy of education, which couldn't be more different from the truth. But it's become associated with that, and so I'm wondering, when we think about what the future is, first of all, do we think, what is our answer to the question, each of us? Do we think that powerful knowledge is essential to the future of schools? But more importantly, has it now become such a contested and misunderstood term that even if there is something useful there, chances are it's not going to be implemented in anything like the way that its originators might have wanted to see? Martin, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's the same with cultural capital as well, or whatever sort of formulation you want to pick up. It means what you want it to mean, becomes the problem. And of using it, then go back to future one and think of it. This is basically, well, it's just a new excuse to teach what we're teaching anyway, with a couple of things we might change here and there. And I don't know. But as a resistance to future two, that's a good thing. And that's where I come in, you know, and agree with. To me, it's what is wise to teach becomes the thing. What is wise in our subject area to teach? And it comes down to what the teachers want to make, but it's choice about the quality of what you're teaching becomes very important, not about, is it short enough so they're going to get good grades in it, you know, and is it easy to take, or whatever, those sorts of choices, or can we get good exam results from this, that, and the other? All those things are wrong. Is it wise to teach? Can this help understanding of the subjects I'm teaching and the things I'm teaching about? Is this a good choice to fit with that, to fit with that, to fit with that, and build up a narrative? And that to me is, whatever you want to call that, powerful narrative, I don't know. But the trouble with
you've just done it, haven't you? Cultural capital turns into cultural literacy. You've just taken powerful knowledge and turned it into powerful narrative, which actually I have to say I quite like. But Ruth, right. Your school sounds like it's picked up the ball and really ran with it in terms of powerful knowledge. So presumably you're going to tell us that you definitely think this is the future of schooling.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, like, I agree with everything you said, Martin, about you know, it shifts the debate towards what rather than how, or more often like, how should we fill the time, or how should we entertain them? You know, I don't think we can underestimate the number of schools up till now and still now that have not given really very much thought at all to what is being taught, and the sequencing and the explanations and the reason, the choice behind all of that, and that's, you know, a bad thing. And the powerful knowledge kind of discussion, you know, people, as you said, will interpret powerful knowledge to mean what they want it to mean, but like, that interpretation in itself is really valuable because it means that they're now thinking about what should be included and why. And like, you know, in terms of schools kind of dropping it as a buzzword and not having much depth to it, like that will happen, and it's always happened you know, as you said, with cultural capital and other things. And you know, and it's always disappointing when that happens, especially if you see it, you get really excited and then you scratch a little bit and then there's not much underneath. But you know, the way to move away from that is just to continue to develop the subject community, to, you know, write and publish blogs and read and share and discuss and make videos, and to continue to reach out and build that, I keep coming back to this word, discourse, but between teachers, because, you know, every teacher wants to do a good job, don't they? And ultimately the powerful knowledge argument is a moral one. And when it's articulated to people, it, you know, I've never really met anyone yet who has disagreed with it once they've understood it. So I think that in terms of yeah, moving the debate forward, and raising kind of people's engagement with that kind of thinking, it's really powerful.
Well, that's absolutely brilliant. It's really fascinating to get the thoughts of two people that clearly think a lot about these issues and you know, don't just follow the crowd on things, think for things themselves. So it's been fantastic. I'm going to take you at your word, Ruth. I'm going to go away now and write a book, not a blog, a book about powerful narrative, and make this the must-have buzzword to use. And then I'll be almost as rich as Martin Robinson. What do you think?
Ambitious.
Anyway, thank you very much for your time, everybody. Great.
Thank you. Lovely to see you all.
Thank you.